do when you're introduced to a new person, whether it's at an event or a party? Normally, you ask about one another, or you talk about the event itself, or um, maybe at times you even discuss the weather. If you're living in Delhi, particularly. I, however, uh, proceed to inadvertently and very, very strongly convince the other person that I am of questionable sanity, which is what I did on New Year's evening when I was introduced to a very nice lady who was doing an excellent job of holding her own against the cold weather. And we were outdoors, and I was introduced to her. And she looked at me and she said, well, what did you learn last year? And I, at any given moment, I'm an extremely emotional person, if you haven't already guessed from this podcast. And so I thought she meant, what did you learn in a personal capacity? So I proceeded to tell her all about my interest in feeling fish, about learning how to cycle the wetlands of Calcutta. And then I started to remember the new friends I've made in the last 1 year. And that's when I started crying as well. And I was howling and I was saying, people are wrong. You can make friends at 36. And, and it's a great, and you need friends. And I went on and on. And in the end, she left. And then the person who introduced us came and said, she was asking, what did you learn as a health journalist? This is Sonali Acharji, and you are listening to Health Wealth, a podcast that hopes to leave you feeling incredibly informed, not confused or overwhelmed, but factually and scientifically informed about your well-being. And also very, very motivated to do something about it. We don't want to leave you feeling exhausted and out of all inspiration that you do nothing but listen to me and then go back to watching TV and eating chocolate. So anyways, I have, after that event, I did sort of introspect on the year that's gone by in terms of health. And I always say this, I'm very lucky to be a health journalist because I get to learn from an entire cohort of doctors. And in the last 1 year, some of my favorite episodes on this podcast has been a discussion where we considered whether menopause can cause breast cancer. We looked at the memory recall of children in conflict zones in India and how conflict impacts them. We explored how plastic surgery can at times be empowering for people, the new technologies that make these surgeries safer and more accurate. We did a brilliant episode on male mental health, which was a particular favorite of mine. And then there were breaking news episodes, which included one that really questioned whether, all our masalas are giving us cancer or not. What do you do when your doctor turns out to be a deep fake? Or how do you survive in the onslaught of WhatsApp medical advice? In the sort of Ozempic craze that was going on for a bit, we also did a great episode which looked at the cause of weight loss and whether these drugs are actually needed to lose weight and how they help diabetic patients as well. Then there was the sort of chaos that happened around the medical examinations. So we had a very, very interesting discussion on what students feel about that mess and how that sort of impacts them. There was a very, very intense viral outbreak season that we had. And while we did look at the treatment and the reasons behind viral outbreaks, we also learned how to stay joyful and safe during them. And lastly, and this episode just remains one of my favorites of all times in the 70 or 80 odd episodes that we've done. And this was an episode with a doctor who described a day in his life after the violence in Calcutta. And then just to learn about what it takes to be a doctor, what a regular day is like. It was extremely interesting. And so this was my year, and I learned a lot. And as I was going over this, it suddenly struck me that you don't want to hear from me. This podcast is to bring you, the best doctors to talk about their journey and their thoughts and their insights. And I was very, very, very keen then to invite a doctor to ask her, "Hi, what did you learn this year?" So I have with me today Dr. Monica Mahajan. She is the medical director of Max Hospital at Panchsheel Park in Delhi. She is also the director of internal medicine at Max Healthcare. Hi, ma'am. How are you?
Hi, very good. How are you?
Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
I well, I had one question, and that's hello. What did you learn last year? What were the biggest takeaways of 2024 for you?
I think perhaps the biggest takeaway I would say is that you have to combine the art and the science of medicine, is what we learned last year, because we were emerging from the pandemic, and it also made us realize that it is not just the prescribing of medicines which is important, but also the empathy involved and the cost of treatment involved. So perhaps this was a great year of relearning for us as doctors in terms of where to draw a line, how to look at the dignity of life of a person, and the quality of life versus the quantity of life. So there were a lot of medical advances that happened in the field, but it was also a year to look back at our careers and to see as to how we've been treating patients and how the pandemic has changed our interpersonal relationships between a doctor and a patient, and how we've become more humane after the whole
Yeah.
pandemic. So that was perhaps the biggest learning this year.
I have this small story where my mother, when she had was admitted due to a heart problem, was asked to pick a doctor, and she didn't look at any of the qualifications. She just looked at the one that was smiling, and since then I started realizing how important it is to have that connection. Um, what does it feel like for a doctor to have that kind of trust placed upon you, and that kind of I mean, I know that there will be patients who will question everything, but the ones who really, really have that faith, how does that make you feel?
So it's a kind of a bonding where the books say that you should not get personally involved in the lives of patients, but then you are treating families from the grandfather to the grandson. Where do you need to understand the dynamics of the family? Where is the stress coming from? Where is the anxiety coming from? And at the same time, how is the family coping with the expenses of the medical expenses of the entire family? So it's the dynamics of the family which makes so much of a difference. It is how you bond with your patients. It is how, in terms of striking a wavelength with the patient. And like you said, that nobody likes a grumpy, non communicative doctor. People want to ask their questions and people want to listen to the authentic answers, not all sorts of gibberish and all sorts of medical terminology, but they want the facts stated to them. So that becomes very important. At times, it's perhaps not just the medicine, but they are only looking for a shoulder to cry on. And that again makes a lot of difference. In terms of the challenges that you face, where there is a lot of onslaught of AI happening at the moment, what I tell my students and what I tell my junior colleagues is that the computer can never replace a human being. The touch of a doctor, the communication between a doctor and a patient is so much of an emotional bond apart from the medical bond, that whatsoever technology in the world comes, it's never going to replace us. We are never going to be an endangered species. We are never going to be an extinct species. With all the algorithms in the world, with all the AI and technology, we are still going to be the people who are going to be in charge of healthcare, come what may.
Not just for, I think, for treatment, even for diagnostics. I recently did a MRI, and I remember earlier there used to be a person who'd be nearby or something, and they'd sort of little talk to you once in a while. And now it's all like cold and it's empty, and you feel so alienated. I'm sure my heart rate would have been high just by that only. But talking about diagnostics, we did an episode which looked at, are you being over tested and over treated in this country, particularly those who can afford it in urban areas. And since then, this is something that is very I guess this trend is here to stay, that anyone can book any test today. Anyone can, figure out any sort of treatment pattern for themselves. How is that affecting healthcare and your life as a doctor?
So I think this change started to happen when patients were no longer called as patients, but they started to be called as consumers or customers. And when you have a customer or a consumer who's either coming to you demanding a test or is getting random tests done just because they can afford to do it, then it creates a lot of nonsensical information which is not required. It only increases the anxiety level of the person who's undergone the test, because every test has a reason for prescribing it. So if you over prescribe the tests or if you get over tested, it is not really going to solve any problems. It is only going to generate so much of extra data, which is of no particular use to a doctor when you're treating a patient. So it's both ways. The doctors these days, the younger lot especially, have forgotten the clinical skills of examination. They will straight away write the prescription with a series of batteries of tests, whether required or not required, and then start interpreting those tests without doing a general physical examination of the patient. So the clinical skill and art is kind of getting lost as far as the newer breed of doctors is concerned. And second, with the onslaught of social media and WhatsApp and other things, people who have an coding capacity will go and randomly get tests done. They'll be led more by their friends, by the WhatsApp messages as to what needs to be done. And then they will actually sit on those tests and do nothing about their smoking or alcohol. Even if they know that they have a high risk lifestyle, they can afford to do the test, but they're not going to do anything corrective about what information has been generated. So, one is in terms of getting the test, and the second is in terms of doing something corrective about the reports that come out. So, if you're doing a test, but it is not that something proactive is done about it, then it is meaningless to spend money. So, it's a kind of doctor shopping, a test shopping, which is happening at the moment because affordability is becoming better. The cost of healthcare in India is much lower compared to our European and Western counterparts. So perhaps the neo rich and the rich are led more by the information on social media rather than by what they genuinely need. And these are the kind of people in the society who will be getting over tested, whereas the poor man will not even be able to afford the basic of test. So there is a lot of demarcation between the people who genuinely need the test and the people who are overutilizing the services.
It's also alluring now, the way these things are packaged. A traveler diagnostic kit, or desk person diagnostic test, to figure out whether, being on the desk is, affecting your health. It makes it all very exciting. And also, I think might be the pandemic, or might be, just the fact that so many health issues are coming up at a very young age as well. But people panic and are more impatient when it comes to health and the results and knowing with utmost certainty than they are with anything else. So I've seen friends who are super, super patient when a plumber will spend 4.5 hours trying to see what's wrong with the pipes. But they won't be able to do that in a hospital, which is, and I keep saying they also need to know why the pipe is broken, right? So it'll take them time. But that's the
I
difference.
think that's actually a very wonderful example that you raised. So we call our heart and our pipes, the arteries, as the plumbing
Yeah.
system. So when you have so much of patients finding out the plumbing challenges in your house, why don't you spend some time in terms of finding out whether your pump or the heart is functioning fine and your plumbing system or the arteries are functioning fine or not? So the amount of sudden cardiac death and cardiac problems that we are seeing in the younger lot, it does make sense to prescribe more cardiac tests to our younger generations. But at the same time, there has to be a lot of emphasis on if you do find that there is a blockage, or if you find that you're a high risk person for a blockage, then what are the corrective measures that we are talking of? Writing a prescription with 3 medicines on it does not end the story. It has to be also in terms of emphasizing on the behavior of a person, in terms of the smoking, in terms of the sedentary lifestyle, in terms of the junk food and the orderance that we have to talk about for a patient, rather than only doing a CT angiography or an angiography and telling him that, okay, look, you're going to die in the next 10 years of a heart attack. It doesn't work that way. I think the part of testing is one aspect of it, but in terms of also looking at the preventing aspect of health is equally important.
A joke between me and my friends, but if I type SED in my phone, there's an auto prompt of sedentary because that's how often I have to type that in my stories. I don't think there's a doctor who doesn't bring that up, and it is of concern. Obesity is becoming the root cause of so many things, if not even becoming a stumbling block for medical interventions. If you're too obese, I've heard many surgeons say that it's difficult to treat as well because the fat itself is interfering so much. Um, do you see a change happening? Do you see something? Because we all know it's bad. We all know we're eating out, we're eating momos, we can't help ourselves and so on. But um, where's the solution?
So there are two extremes of patients: one who are extremely motivated and will take up the challenge, and the other is the quick fix kind of guys who will look at injections, like you mentioned, Ozempic, and look at bariatric surgery. But the bottom line remains that whether you go in for bariatric surgery and then regain all the weight after 5 years, 7 years of the surgery, or whether you're using injections which have a lot of side effects, you're buying them in the gray market and using them without a prescription, that is not really the way forward. So the process has to be a two-way communication between the doctor and the patient. And then the most important is the mental aspect of it. There has to be a willingness and there has to be a motivation. If those are lacking, then no medicine or no surgery is going to work, because you do a bariatric surgery and after that, after a couple of years, you're back to your eating habits, you're back to your sedentary lifestyle. Gradually, the weight is going to creep back on and it's not really going to be what you actually desired for. And weight is one of the most depressing things that can happen to you, because it starts a vicious cycle. The more heavy you are, the more obese you are, the more you tend to snack, the more you tend to kind of give it up. And in terms of that vicious cycle between depression and weight starts to happen. So breaking that cycle and having the willingness to do something about it is the most important thing. We are seeing so much of obesity in our school children that it is horrendous the way the next generation is heading towards disaster.
Yeah. In fact, I had a 21-year-old come and she was about 5'4" and weighed over 80 kilos. And she said, I don't know why I'm putting on weight. I don't even take sugar in my coffee or tea. And she was feeling so depressed because you've trained yourself to have that chai without the chini. And it's still putting on weight. And I couldn't figure out, like, if she doesn't have added sugar, where's the weight coming from? And over a 2-hour conversation, suddenly she says, "Oh, I love Pepsi." I found that so
That's your answer.
incredible that
Yeah.
we see added sugars, what we are adding, but not what outsiders are adding. So, how often would you trust a packaged food as a doctor?
In US, it is mandatory that they mention the sugar and the calorie content on the outside of every package. But does that prevent the Americans from picking up those packets and not eating them and not consuming them? So one is in terms of the educating the masses in terms of where the bad sugars and the calories are coming from. The second aspect is in terms of burning those calories. So the net output is in terms of how much of calories you've consumed versus how much of calories you've burnt. So educating is important, not having junk food in the school canteens is important. But at the same time, it is not just the consumption, it is also the calorie burning, which is equally important. So you can literally tell people not to have unhealthy food, but at the same time, you also need to make sure that they are doing their 5,000 or 10,000 steps, depending on how and what age group and what comorbidities they have. Indulge in active sports rather than sitting in front of a PlayStation or a Netflix and watching their serials. So it is how you burn those calories is as important as the kind of fatty acids that you're consuming, the saturated fats that you're consuming. People are becoming aware. A lot of restaurants, a lot of food places are now giving the calorie content below their menu in terms of how many calories are there in each item. So you can actually make sensible food choices. It's not that we tell people not to eat outside or not to indulge themselves, but you can have one cheat day a week, maximum two cheat days a week, but all 7 days can't really be cheat days. You have to do justice to your body. This is the only life that you're going to live.
I wish, people could understand the history of food, or, why is it that whenever we call someone, if I were to call you home, I would say come for lunch or come for tea. Why can't I just say come and talk to me? Why can't you just come and be my friend? Because food seems to have gone from that moment of scarcity to a moment of plentiful, and we've not really adapted so much to that. In fact, a very, very interesting thing I learned was, because I always wondered what's wrong with added sugar, right? I mean, everyone says your insulin spikes and, you get more calories. But I kept thinking, like, why do we have it? Why do we have refined sugar at all? And one of the earliest records of refining sugar was refining date for the laborers who built Egyptian pyramids, which really blew me away because that makes sense. If I were to build a pyramid, I'd need instant energy. But, if I'm just here talking to you, I would probably not. So, yeah, I wish there was more awareness of the purpose and history of food, because
So, if you actually read Sapiens, how we
yes,
evolved from hunter gatherers to people who discovered fire and
that
then
was
started cooking our
incredible.
food, it's
Yeah.
amazing to read that book as to how we've evolved, not just mentally and physically, but that is also the root of all our illnesses today. We may have evolved as far as our language and our science is concerned, but in terms of the diseases also, they have evolved with time because of the plenty of food, easy access to food, in terms of the economic growth that the world has experienced, the ability to fight the famines and the droughts. So when you are surrounded by food everywhere, it is perhaps an easy indulgence to eat more than what the human body needs. And the insulin and the sugar are the basic drivers. The brain loves sugar. So, anybody who's a little deprived of sugar feels lethargic and lazy. So, when we do that, we kind of step over the line and we try and indulge in so much of sugar that it gives us a thrill. But that is where the insulin resistance comes, that is where the metabolic syndrome comes, and sugar is not just the direct sugars, it is the indirect sugars. It is the maida, it is the white breads, it's the pizzas and the buns. So that is where the root cause of all evil lies, because whether it is in terms of your obesity, whether it is polycystic ovaries in young girls, whether it is diabetes and insulin resistance, heart problems, the bottom line is that once you consume the bad sugars are intricately related to the fats. So it is the sugar and the insulin resistance which is leading to all problems rather than the fat per
Yeah,
se.
yeah. Um, I did promise that the podcast is also about motivation and good news. So supposing I know all this and I still choose to make myself very, very sick, and I can afford the best treatment. What advances have happened in your treatment, which perhaps, say, when you started your career would have been impossible to think of performing, and which are very easy today?
So one is in terms of the diagnostics have become state of the art. The turnaround time of tests has become so quick that I'm not lost for 48 hours when I see a patient as to what I'm dealing with. The turnaround time for most blood tests have become anywhere from 4 to 6 hours in terms of your biomarkers for sepsis or infections, in terms of your cardiac markers for heart attacks and problems. So the timing for initiating the correct antibiotics, the timings for opening a blood vessel when somebody has an heart attack, the timing for doing any kind of stroke management, those timings have really been cut short because of the kind of biochemistry, the kind of lab tests, the kind of imaging technologies, from advanced cardiac MRIs to CT scans to angiographies. The whole technology game is changing so rapidly that it has become so much easier for us to be diagnosing a patient. So the time between arrival of the patient to the diagnosis is really quick these days. So that's the first part of it. The second is that once I know the diagnosis, then my choice of the medicines becomes much more correct. My choice of antibiotics becomes better. So I'm not losing precious time and putting the life of my patient at stake. So that is the other aspect of it. And the third thing that has happened in India, perhaps, is also in terms of the reduction in the cost of medicines. So earlier, there were some medicines which were a monopoly of some of the MNC companies, and an average Indian would not be able to afford them. Whether we are talking of heart failure medicines, or whether we are talking of some of the newer anti-diabetic medications. But now, with multiple companies jumping into the bandwagon, and a lot of companies manufacturing these expensive medications, the cost of medication has come down drastically, which is good for the patient, that now they can very easily afford these fancy drugs, which we only used to read in the books, but were not able to provide to our patients because of their prohibitive costs. So the cost of treatment, when you have 10 people who are selling sweets in a row, the cost automatically by competition comes down. It's the same with
Yeah.
medicine. When 10 people are manufacturing the same drug, it has to be a competitive pricing. So the end benefit passes on to the patient. So I'm much happier prescribing medicines as per the guidelines, because now my patients can afford it. The second aspect that has happened is also in terms of the generic drugs and the affordability, that
Yeah.
the government has ensured that an average citizen is able to afford those medicines. The third thing that has perhaps happened with the pandemic is the easy accessibility to technology. So people are able to do online consults sitting in a remote corner in a small town or a village, and access the knowledge of the specialist. So I think that is one of the biggest game changers, is in terms of the online information available, as well as the video consulting facilities which are available for small town people to be able to see what is wrong with them and how they should approach that problem as far as the medical aspect is concerned. So it is not that the average person is being devoid of the state of health treatment plans. Now it is much more affordable, it is much more accessible, and people are learning to use technology to their benefit, so that they know that what is best for my parents' treatment, what is the best advances that have happened in a particular cancer, or what are the newer drugs which are available. So the awareness has tremendously increased by way of your podcasts that you're doing, in terms of enlightening the public, or in terms of the use of media. And more importantly, it has become a responsible journalism, in the sense that at times we used to read news which was published in magazines and newspapers, and which was hardly medically authentic. So now we are coming across much more responsible reporting of news. So people actually follow that advice basis what is being advised in the paper for simple diseases like dengue, versus any kind of newer vaccinations that have come. So the media and the healthcare are, I think, in partnership with each other in terms of creating that awareness. And the last year has been really good in terms of enlightening the people as to what their treatment options are.
Yeah. Um, I think the favorite treatment procedure I learned about in 2024 was a fecal transplant. Because there's so much being talked about gut health. And I love the idea that one day a doctor can open a fridge and pick a bacteria and just inject it in me, and somehow maybe all my health problems will be solved. The promise of what doctors and pharmacists and diagnosticians are doing is just so exciting to learn about. So I think that the change in how health is reported has also happened because we're just able to spend so much more time with doctors today and really talk to them. And I'm very, very grateful for your time. Just one more thing, and feel free to say no, because this is the bit where it might get a little personal. But I've always wondered, do doctors have a favorite organ? Like, is there one organ which you just love to read about or know more about? Mine is the
Okay.
gallbladder. I'm saying it
So for me, perhaps it's the brain that fascinates me the most, as to not just the uh, anatomical aspect of the brain, but also in terms of the thinking capacity of the brain. So that is something that is very close to my heart in terms of trying to study what drives the brain in one direction and the mind in the other direction. So that is perhaps one of my favorite topics. But at the same time, I do read a lot of medical fiction. So I want to understand how the uh, authors and how the people who are writing science fiction are moving in one direction. So actually, a lot of books that you've read in the past are coming true now. So I was talking the other day about War of the Worlds and H.G. Wells as to how he described that creatures from Mars were killing the human beings because of the fact that they were technologically advanced, and finally the Martians die because they have no immunity to the bugs on Earth. So the same way, the constant fight between the bugs and the humans is something which is equally fascinating for me. So in terms of people like Wells or Asimov or your Robin Cook, so as to what they're talking of is not totally without a scientific reason to it. So when you're looking at today's scenario of a stem cell therapy, or when you're looking at CAR-T as a therapy for diseases, there are books that have been written even 1 or 2 decades before in terms of all these technologies. And yes, now those technologies are available to the patients. So when you're talking of fecal transplant, there are stories which have been written where people have described these and anybody would laugh it off and say, "What are you
Yeah,
talking of?" kind of a thing.
yeah.
So it's just that now the science fiction is becoming so much of a reality. And people had predicted of a pandemic, and then COVID happened. And yes, people said, "Oh, I read that book and it said that this kind of a pandemic is going to strike the earth." So there is a very thin dividing line between what is reality and what is fiction in today's days and time. And you can imagine and let your imagination run wild. And believe me, that scientists in some corner of the world would be working on that
I
and
can believe
trying to make
that.
it true.
They're
They've
trying to
transplanted
regrow
a
teeth.
pig in a pig kidney into a human being recently. So,
Mm.
I mean, who would believe that would be happening? Stem cells to restore eyesight in terms of people restoring their hearing in babies who are born with the deafness. So, the science is making so rapid advances that it is quicker than the model of the next iPhone that comes. You are to keep abreast as a doctor with what is happening new. If you don't keep reading about what is happening new in the world of medicine, you are very soon going to be an outdated doctor. And then your patient will have Googled more and you'll sound silly in front of the patient because the patient always Googles before he comes to your room.
I find that so fascinating. How every problem has a solution somewhere or the other, and we never give up. Um, in terms of stress and mental health, because that's also been a big thing last year, there have been a lot of solutions. The people who are doing art now, or gardening, or getting puppies, or there's a whole lot of solutions that one is looking for to beat stress. How do doctors deal with it? You're the most stressed out profession I can think of. Although you do an excellent job with dealing with it, but how do you?
I think all of us also went through the pandemic the same way as the patients did, and we realized that we need a stress breaker. So, in my case, it's basically in terms of writing, not just the medical aspect of things, but I travel a lot. So, I've written a travel book and I do a lot of academic publications. Similarly, a lot of my colleagues have discovered their old passion for music. They are now singing or playing instruments. There are others who are going bird watching. So it's that the whole world can be divided between the pre-pandemic and the post-pandemic. So we are as much human as the other people are. And during the pandemic, we've realized the value of the peace of mind. So we've kind of curtailed our work hours so that we are not compromising with our own mental health. We are giving quality time to our family. So that's a big change that has happened. A lot of my colleagues who used to work till 10 p.m., 11 p.m. at night and continue seeing patients realized that they have to draw a line somewhere. And the pandemic taught them the big message that yes, family life is as important as the rest of it. So our work hours are much more sensible. A lot of us have taken up to gardening, reading, music, singing, writing, a whole lot of things. And I think perhaps the amount of travel that we are starting to do has increased majorly. We want to tick our bucket list and say that we've traveled this part of the world and done this and done that kind of a thing. So I think that is where we are looking at our stress busters. We don't want to work 365 days of the year because there is a lot of stress when you are dealing with a sick and a dying patient. But we are realizing that our health is as important as the health of our patients. We are spending a lot more time on ourselves rather than totally spending time at work.
Yeah, and then that balance is so important. I'm still trying to find it.
Yeah, so am I. Don't worry.
Just one last thing, just to make this a little bit. We are in the middle of winter, and viral outbreaks have started. We had a particularly bad monsoon season when there were quite a bit of dengue/dengue cases and chikungunya and mpox and whatnot. So with this particular season when respiratory infections seem to be on the rise, is there some basic advice you could give on how to stay safe?
Keep yourself adequately clad. You're not a superhero that you can go down the alley wearing a superhero uniform and not wearing your mufflers and your gloves and your coats. So keep yourself warm. Avoid sudden temperature changes from a very hot room to a very cold environment and vice versa. If you are sick, then at least don't expose your friends and your colleagues at work. Take a day off and do that much of courtesy to other people not to spread the virus. Eat healthy. And most importantly, if you are one of those people who has a lot of illnesses, including diabetes, heart problems, lung problems, asthma, then do update your vaccinations for flu and pneumonia. So I think it's more important that you look after yourself and at the same time make sure that you're not spreading the viruses and the disease.
And how many haldi lattes should I have in a day?
Uh,
Or
I'm so next you're going to ask me how many times should I steam and how many times should I
as
gargle. So I don't think you need a haldi latte. If you can just grab a simple one fruit a day at least, ideally two fruits a day, that has
yes,
enough vitamin C in it to keep you healthy.
perfect. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Ma.
Always a pleasure. Take care.
I did mention the gallbladder while I was talking to Dr. Mahajan, and that's because out of all the organs, somehow, for whatever reason, we talk the least about the gallbladder, and then it's something that even I'm struggling to understand why. So, we are planning an episode soon on gallbladder health and well-being. So, do tune in. And if you've enjoyed this episode, or if there's another organ you'd wish for us to discuss on this series or a particular disease, then please do write to us. We are available on pods@indiatoday.com, or you can message us on 8588966996. And, please do leave a rating if this discussion brought some value and meaning and perspective to your life. We have, you can review us on Apple, on YouTube Music, on Spotify, on the India Today website, and various other audio streaming platforms.